In America, athletes are often celebrated for what they can do with their bodies, but rarely for what they dare to say with their voices. For decades, the unspoken rule was simple: win the fight, entertain the crowd, and stay silent. But Muhammad Ali refused to play that role. At a time when Black Americans were expected to be grateful, obedient, and invisible, Ali stood in front of the world and spoke with unapologetic clarity. He didn't whisper. He didn't ask permission. He challenged the very system that made him famous, and America was not ready for that. To some, he was a hero, a fearless voice in an age of injustice. To others, he was a threat, too loud, too proud, too dangerous to ignore. But Muhammad Ali was never just a boxer. From the moment he stepped into the spotlight, he turned every microphone into a political stage. Race, religion, war, identity, nothing was off limits. In a nation divided by segregation and fear, Ali dared to speak truths that many were too afraid to confront. This was America in the 1960s, a country wrestling with its conscience. Black communities were rising up, demanding dignity and justice. The civil rights movement was shaking the foundations of power. And in the middle of this storm stood a young heavyweight champion who refused to be silent. Ali understood something that few athletes before him had realized. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is compliance. He saw how Black athletes were praised when they entertained, but punished when they questioned authority. He saw how America loved Black champions, but feared Black consciousness. And instead of shrinking himself to fit expectations, Ali expanded his voice. When he changed his name, America panicked. When he embraced Islam, America watched closely. And when he refused to fight in the Vietnam War, America turned against him. His belts were taken. His career was suspended. His reputation was attacked. He was labeled unpatriotic, dangerous, even a traitor. But Ali never backed down, because he believed that justice mattered more than approval. This documentary is not about boxing victories or championship titles. It is about courage. The courage to stand alone when the cost is everything. It is about race, power, and the price of speaking truth in a country that prefers comfort over change. Muhammad Ali didn't just fight opponents in the ring. He fought racism. He fought war. He fought silence. And in doing so, he changed what it meant to be an athlete in America forever. This is the story of Muhammad Ali on the political stage, where fists were no longer his strongest weapon. His voice was. Before Muhammad Ali ever stepped onto the world stage, America was already fighting a war within itself. A war over race, power, and who was allowed to be heard. The country spoke loudly about freedom and democracy, but for millions of Black Americans, those words rang hollow. In the decades leading up to the 1960s, segregation was not just a social reality, it was law. Schools, buses, restaurants, neighborhoods, and even public restrooms were divided by race. Jim Crow laws enforced a system where Black Americans were expected to know their place and remain silent within it. Power in America was overwhelmingly white. Political institutions, media, and economic systems were controlled by those who benefited from inequality. Black voices were either ignored or suppressed, and when they did rise, they were often labeled dangerous or radical. Sports reflected this imbalance. Black athletes were allowed to succeed, but only under strict conditions. They could run, jump, and fight for America, but they were not encouraged to think, speak, or challenge the system. The message was clear: entertain, but don't disrupt. Those who broke this rule paid a heavy price. When Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball, he was celebrated, but only because he remained calm, quiet, and controlled. His silence was praised as professionalism. His restraint was seen as acceptable progress. But beneath the surface, anger and frustration were growing. Black communities were tired of being patient. They were tired of waiting for equality that never came. The promise of America, liberty, justice, opportunity, felt like a lie written for someone else. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, a new generation was emerging. They were younger, louder, and less willing to accept humiliation. Sit-ins, marches, and protests spread across the country. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and with it came fear from those in power. America was at a crossroads. Change was inevitable, but how far would it go? And who would be allowed to lead it? Into this tense and divided nation stepped a young black athlete with an unmatched voice, unlimited confidence, and no intention of staying silent. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to be heard, and soon America would realize that Muhammad Ali was not just entering the boxing ring, he was stepping directly into the center of its deepest conflict. When Cassius Clay emerged on the national stage, he didn't look like any athlete America had seen before. He wasn't quiet, he wasn't humble, and he certainly wasn't willing to shrink himself to make others comfortable. From the beginning, Clay announced his presence with words as sharp as his punches. In an era when black athletes were expected to show gratitude and restraint, Clay showed confidence, loud, playful, and unapologetic confidence. He predicted his victories. He mocked his opponents. He spoke directly to the media without fear. To many Americans, this behavior felt threatening. To others, it felt revolutionary. The media didn't know what to do with him. Some called him arrogant. Others dismissed him as immature. But behind the bravado was something deeper, a young man refusing to be shaped by expectations that were never meant to serve him. Clay understood the power of attention. He knew cameras followed controversy, and he used that spotlight deliberately. Every interview became a performance. Every microphone became a stage. And while many saw entertainment, others began to sense something more serious beneath the surface. As Clay rose through the boxing ranks, America watched closely. He was winning fights, but he was also challenging norms. He didn't speak like previous champions. He didn't act grateful for acceptance. He didn't hide his intelligence or his opinions. To white America, he was unsettling. To black America, he was inspiring. For young black Americans, Clay represented a new kind of possibility. He showed that confidence could be power, that visibility could be resistance, and that silence was no longer the only option. He made it clear that being great didn't require being quiet. This made him dangerous, not because of his fists, but because of his voice. He was a black man with global attention who refused to follow the rules of respectability that had kept others in line. As his fame grew, so did the tension around him. Commentators began to ask whether he was good for the sport. Politicians questioned his influence. Sponsors worried about his unpredictability. Clay was not just winning fights. He was disrupting comfort. But what many didn't realize was that Clay's rise was happening at the same time America's patience with injustice was wearing thin. The country was changing, and Clay was changing with it. He was no longer just an athlete climbing toward a title. He was becoming a symbol of pride, resistance, and possibility. And soon, the world would see that Cassius Clay didn't intend to simply step into the spotlight. He intended to use it. As Cassius Clay's fame grew, so did the pressure for him to stay in his place. The message from media executives, sponsors, and political leaders was subtle but clear. Be a champion, not a critic. America was comfortable celebrating black excellence, so long as it didn't challenge the system behind it. But Clay refused to follow that script. He began speaking openly about race, identity, and power at a time when such conversations were considered dangerous. While other athletes avoided controversy to protect their careers, Clay leaned into it. He questioned why black Americans were asked to risk their lives for a country that denied them basic rights. He challenged the idea that patriotism required silence. This was a bold move in a nation already on edge. By the early 1960s, America was experiencing widespread protests, police violence, and racial unrest. Civil rights leaders were being watched, arrested, and sometimes killed. In this climate, Clay's voice carried weight, and that frightened those in power. The media began framing him as irresponsible. Commentators suggested he was a bad role model. Some accused him of inflaming racial tensions. The same confidence that once entertained audiences was now described as arrogance, even aggression. But Clay understood something critical. Silence would not protect him. Silence would only make him invisible. He knew that being quiet had never saved black Americans from discrimination. It had only made injustice easier to ignore. And so, instead of softening his voice, Clay sharpened it. He spoke with humor, poetry, and defiance. He used wit as a weapon. Every interview became a statement, not just about boxing, but about dignity and self-worth. When reporters tried to mock him, he turned the joke back on them. When critics tried to diminish him, he stood taller. For young black audiences, this was electrifying. Clay represented a refusal to apologize for existence. He showed that speaking up did not require permission. That pride was not something to be ashamed of. But for the establishment, he was becoming a problem. Athletes had influence. Influence could inspire action, and action could threaten power. Clay's refusal to remain silent marked a turning point, not only in his career, but in the role of athletes in American society. He was no longer just participating in sports history. He was rewriting it. And soon, his voice would collide with the most powerful institutions in the country, forcing America to confront a question it had long avoided. What happens when a black athlete refuses to stay silent and chooses conscience over comfort? When Cassius Clay announced that he had embraced Islam and changed his name to Muhammad Ali, the reaction was immediate and explosive. This was not just a personal spiritual decision. In the eyes of America, it was a political act. During the 1960s, Islam was widely misunderstood and often portrayed as a threat. Media narratives linked it to extremism, separatism, and anti-American sentiment. For many white Americans, a famous black athlete converting to Islam triggered deep fears. Fears rooted not in facts, but in prejudice. Ali's decision challenged multiple boundaries at once. He rejected Christianity, the dominant religion in America. He rejected his slave name, and he aligned himself, at least initially, with a religious movement that openly criticized white supremacy. To those in power, this was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Politicians and commentators questioned his loyalty. They framed his faith as radical, his beliefs as subversive. Newspapers emphasized his religious identity whenever possible, subtly suggesting that his conversion made him un-American. Ali understood exactly what was happening. He knew that Islam had become a symbol, one that the establishment feared. But instead of retreating, he leaned into his identity. He demanded to be called Muhammad Ali. He spoke proudly about his faith. He refused to explain himself to those who had never tried to understand him. This refusal was powerful. For many black Americans, Ali's conversion represented liberation from imposed identities. It was an assertion of self-definition in a country that had long denied black people the right to define themselves. For young Muslims, Ali became proof that faith and dignity could coexist on the world stage. But to the political establishment, Ali was now more than a loud athlete. He was a symbol of resistance, racial, religious, and ideological. Surveillance increased, criticism intensified, and pressure mounted behind the scenes to control him, silence him, or make an example out of him. America could tolerate a black champion. It could even tolerate a confident one. But a black champion who rejected its religious norms, questioned its politics, and refused to submit quietly, that was something else entirely. Ali's faith had placed him directly in the crosshairs of political fear. And soon, that fear would turn into action, swift, public, and unforgiving, because a nation at war was about to demand loyalty. And Muhammad Ali was about to say no. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War had become one of the most divisive conflicts in American history. Thousands of young men were being drafted to fight a war many didn't understand, in a country most had never heard of. Protest movements were growing, but dissent was still widely viewed as unpatriotic. When Muhammad Ali was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1966, the nation assumed he would comply. After all, he was a public figure, a world champion, and a symbol of American strength. But Ali had other ideas. He refused induction, citing his religious beliefs and moral objections to the war. His reasoning was simple, yet powerful. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." Those words would echo through history, not as a slogan, but as a moral challenge to American policy. Ali argued that he could not fight abroad for freedoms he did not enjoy at home. He questioned why Black Americans were being sent to die for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. His stance connected the war overseas to injustice at home, and that connection terrified the establishment. The reaction was swift and severe. Politicians condemned him. Sports organizations stripped him of his heavyweight title. Boxing commissions revoked his license. He was fined, sentenced to prison, and banned from fighting at the peak of his career. To many Americans, Ali became the face of defiance. Some called him a coward, others labeled him a traitor. Media outlets turned against him almost overnight. A man once celebrated as a national hero was now portrayed as a national enemy. But Ali never wavered. He spoke calmly, firmly, and with conviction. He made it clear that his refusal was not about fear. It was about conscience. He believed that obedience without morality was not patriotism. It was submission. Ali's resistance transformed him from a sports figure into a political symbol. He stood alone against the government, knowing full well the cost. His career was frozen. His income vanished. His freedom was at risk. Yet through it all, Ali remained unwavering. He accepted punishment without apology, believing that standing for justice was worth any price. In a country that demanded loyalty without question, Muhammad Ali asked a question no one wanted to answer. What is the moral cost of silence? And by refusing to fight, Ali fought one of the most important battles of his life, not with fists, but with principle. Muhammad Ali paid a heavy price for refusing to fight in Vietnam. Almost overnight, everything he had built was taken from him. His heavyweight title was stripped. His boxing license was revoked. At just 25 years old, during what should have been the prime of his career, Ali was banned from the sport he loved. The punishment was swift and merciless. He was convicted of draft evasion and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Though he remained free during appeals, the threat of incarceration loomed over his life. Promoters turned away. Sponsors disappeared. The media painted him as reckless and dangerous. For 3.5 years, Ali was effectively erased from professional boxing. Financially, the consequences were devastating. Without the ability to fight, Ali lost millions of dollars in potential earnings. He struggled to support himself and his family. The lifestyle he once enjoyed vanished, replaced by uncertainty and fear. Emotionally, the isolation was crushing. Many former allies distanced themselves. Fans who once cheered him now booed. Even within Black communities, opinions were divided. Some believed Ali had gone too far. Others feared the consequences of supporting him publicly. Yet, despite losing everything, Ali refused to break. He traveled the country speaking at colleges and community events, explaining his position and defending his beliefs. He spoke calmly, thoughtfully, and with intelligence, challenging young Americans to think critically about war, race, and conscience. These years away from the ring transformed him. Without boxing as a distraction, Ali matured. His voice deepened. His understanding of the world grew. He became less playful, more reflective. The man who once shouted predictions now spoke with quiet authority. History, however, had not yet caught up with him. At the time, Ali was not widely seen as courageous. He was seen as disruptive. The government wanted to make an example of him, to show what happened when a public figure defied authority. But Ali understood something essential. Justice is rarely popular in its moment. He believed that truth didn't need approval to exist. And even in isolation, even under threat, he held on to that belief. Losing everything forced Ali to confront the deepest question of all. Who are you when the world turns against you? And in answering that question, Muhammad Ali revealed a strength far greater than any championship belt. While Muhammad Ali was banned from boxing, America itself was in the middle of a profound transformation. The civil rights movement was reaching its most volatile phase. Protests filled the streets, leaders were assassinated, communities were divided between those demanding change and those clinging to the status quo. Ali stood at the crossroads of this moment. Unlike many civil rights leaders, Ali was not an organizer or a politician. He did not lead marches or draft legislation. His influence came from visibility, from being impossible to ignore. And even in exile from boxing, his presence loomed large. Ali's stance against the Vietnam War aligned him with a growing wave of resistance, especially among young people and Black Americans. His refusal validated feelings that many were afraid to express. If a world champion could say no, perhaps others could too. Yet, Ali's relationship with the civil rights movement was complex. Some leaders embraced him as a symbol of courage. Others were uneasy with his confrontational style and religious identity. Ali did not always speak the careful language of coalition building. He spoke bluntly, emotionally, and from personal conviction. But that raw honesty was precisely what made him powerful. Ali represented a shift, from asking for acceptance to demanding dignity. He was not interested in assimilation. He wanted recognition of humanity on his own terms. In that sense, he embodied a new phase of Black resistance, one less patient, less apologetic, and more self-defined. His courage inspired a new generation of athlete activists. For the first time, sports and social justice were openly intertwined. Ali showed that athletes did not have to choose between success and conscience. The cost of that choice, however, was immense. Ali watched from the sidelines as history unfolded, unable to fight, yet deeply engaged in the struggle. He spoke at universities. He debated politicians. He listened to students questioning authority and redefining patriotism. In these conversations, Ali's image began to change. What once seemed reckless started to look principled. What once felt dangerous began to feel necessary. Public opinion slowly shifted, not because Ali softened his stance, but because America began to catch up to his questions. Ali did not follow the civil rights movement, he challenged it, and in doing so, he expanded its boundaries. He reminded the nation that civil rights were not only about laws, but about conscience, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice. And as the movement evolved, so did Muhammad Ali, waiting, patiently, for the moment when history would finally hear him clearly. In 1971, after years of legal battles and public controversy, the United States Supreme Court unanimously overturned Muhammad Ali's conviction. The ruling acknowledged what Ali had argued all along, that his refusal to serve in the Vietnam War was protected by law and conscience. With one decision, the narrative began to change. The same man once labeled a traitor was now recognized as a victim of injustice. The punishment he had endured, years without boxing, income, or public support, could not be undone. But history had shifted in his favor. Ali returned to the ring not as the brash young champion he once was, but as a symbol of resilience. His body had aged, his reflexes had slowed, but his spirit was unbreakable. Every fight now carried meaning beyond sport. It was a statement of survival. Victories like the Rumble in the Jungle and the Thrilla in Manila cemented his legacy not just as a great boxer, but as a man who reclaimed everything that had been taken from him. He proved that principle and perseverance could coexist with greatness. More importantly, Ali's stand redefined what courage looked like in America. He showed that patriotism did not mean blind obedience, that love for one's country could include criticism. That moral resistance was not weakness, but strength. Over time, public opinion transformed completely. Schools taught his story. Politicians quoted his words. Cultural institutions honored his legacy. Ali became a global ambassador for peace, humanitarianism, and human rights. Athletes across generations followed his path. From speaking out against racial injustice to challenging political power, Ali's influence echoed far beyond boxing. He opened the door for voices once told to remain silent. Yet Ali never claimed to be perfect. He acknowledged his flaws. He evolved. He listened. His greatness lay not in never changing, but in never abandoning his conscience. In his later years, as Parkinson's disease slowed his body, his legacy only grew stronger. The man who once shook the world with his fists now moved it with quiet dignity. History ultimately gave Muhammad Ali what his own era could not: understanding. He was no longer remembered as a problem to be managed, but as a conscience that refused to be ignored. And in that vindication, Ali's greatest victory became clear. He didn't just fight opponents in the ring, he fought injustice and changed the meaning of justice forever. Decades have passed since Muhammad Ali stood alone against the weight of a nation, yet his voice still echoes through our world today. The issues he confronted, war, racism, inequality, and the cost of speaking out, have not disappeared. They have simply taken new forms. In every generation, there are moments when silence feels safer than truth, when conformity is rewarded and conscience is punished. Muhammad Ali reminds us that progress has never been built by those who stayed quiet. Ali's legacy lives on wherever athletes kneel, speak, or refuse to be used as symbols without substance. His courage gave permission to question authority, to define identity on one's own terms, and to understand patriotism as accountability, not obedience. What made Ali extraordinary was not that he was fearless. It was that he acted despite fear. He knew the consequences, he accepted them, and he stood firm anyway. In today's world of instant outrage and fleeting attention, Ali's example challenges us to think deeper. Are we willing to sacrifice comfort for principle? Are we prepared to lose approval in order to keep integrity? Ali never asked to be a hero. He simply refused to betray himself. That refusal changed history. His life teaches us that justice does not arrive quietly. It demands disruption. It demands courage. And it demands individuals willing to pay a price before society is ready to listen. Muhammad Ali's greatest fight was never against another man. It was against a system that demanded submission instead of conscience. And in winning that fight, he left us with a timeless question, one that still matters today. When the moment comes to choose between silence and truth, which side will you stand on?